Hello, everyone. I hope you have welcome to CIGI's first virtual event, Global Crises and the Role of Think Tanks. My name is Andrea Harding, and I lead the Community Relations and Events team for CIGI. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the CIGI campus and this evening's speakers live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. CIGI is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Since this is a virtual event, you might be viewing the territory, and I encourage you to do some research on the territory in which you live, work, and play on. Indigenous communities are being hit particularly hard by the pandemic with lack of health care and clean water. It is our responsibility as settlers to ensure they are not forgotten in our response to this and our voices are heard. As this is our first virtual event, I ask for patience and understanding as we work through this new format. We've done some test runs, but as with any event, there can always be some surprises. For example, my computer decided to restart about 10 minutes ago, and I just made it back online. We have some virtual events coming up, including a global think tank town hall on May 13th, and a discussion on COVID-19 and the economy coming up at the end of May or early June. We're still finalizing the details, so please visit cgonline.org/events for registration or subscribe to our newsletter. We also just started the second season of the Big Tech podcast. If you haven't checked it out yet, Big Tech is a bi-weekly podcast that explores how emerging technologies are reshaping democracy, the economy, and society. It is hosted by CIGI Senior Fellow Taylor Owen and David Skok, the Editor-in-Chief of The Logic. Episode 2, which came out today, features Douglas Rushkoff, the author of Team Human. You can listen and subscribe at www.bigtechpodcast.com. Before we start the program, CIGI would like to thank all the frontline and essential workers for their commitment and courage in keeping us all safe. We are staying home for you. We're going to begin the evening with a presentation from CIGI's Managing Director, Aaron Shull, on how think tanks can offer guidance on proactive policy responses to global crises, including the current COVID-19 pandemic. He will discuss some of the challenges we have started to see, especially around cybersecurity, as we're online so much more now, and the role of organizations like CIGI play in responding to these issues. I'm sure many speak before. He is a familiar face at CIGI. In addition to advising on a range of legal and corporate, Aaron has substantive expertise in international law, global security, and internet governance. He coordinated the CIGI essay series governing cyberspace during a crisis in trust, where it has come in very handy over the last couple of months. Following his presentation, Aaron will be joined by Kristy Smith, a communications advisor at CIGI, where she specializes in strategic communications, public relations, and stakeholder engagement. In the fall, Kristy will be pursuing a master's in international public policy at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Kristy may be joined by her golden retriever, Bentley, who's a favorite visitor to CIGI, and we can't wait to see in person again. Bentley's pastimes include snuggles, walks, and being tormented by the bunnies in his backyard. Hopefully he'll make an appearance for us tonight. We will then open it up to questions from our audience at home. Questions can be submitted by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of this window. Kristy will read them out for everyone to hear, and as with past community events, this event is being recorded and will be available on our website in a few days. I hope you enjoy it, and I will now turn it over to Aaron.
Great, thank you very much, Andrea, and it's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I'm going to do a screen share because I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share with everyone this evening. So just bear with me for one moment and I'll get that shared with you. Okay, so tonight I want to talk to you about a few things. This presentation is going to provide an overview of how COVID-19 has impacted the digital world, and it's going to highlight a few policy concerns as they relate to cybersecurity, data governance and surveillance, as well as misinformation and disinformation. And then I want to talk to you about what think tanks are, how they work, and how they're responding to the global crisis. But before doing that, I want to share a story. I want to talk to you this evening about this range of issues: cybersecurity, data collection, fake news, the role of think tanks, and then we're going to turn to questions. But now the story. I want to talk to you about Dennis Johnson. Dennis has spent extensive hours preparing for his PhD thesis. Indeed, he would be the first in his family to graduate from university, let alone earning a doctorate. And earning a doctorate is a significant undertaking. It's time-consuming, it's demanding, and it requires a level of sacrifice and dedication that many just do not have. It simply cannot be quantified how much work it is to do a doctorate. So this moment when Dennis was being asked to defend his PhD dissertation was a big moment in his life, a huge moment in his life. Indeed, one of the most important moments. And so for Dennis, he'd invited his entire family. So they were all there in this video conference to celebrate his accomplishments. And in fact, Dennis's experience was unlike many before him, because as many universities moved online and became digital, Dennis realized that his defense of his dissertation would be very, very different than anyone in the previous semesters. So this day, there was a large audience. There was almost 40 people there to support Dennis. He had his closest friends, his family, his classmates, his professors. Even his 68-year-old grandmother was in attendance because he wanted to share this moment with everyone. And halfway through Dennis's presentation on the struggles of African Americans in California's education system, something was wrong. Maybe for Dennis, he thought he was just nervous. The screen had blurred, but he had no idea what was about to occur. His PowerPoint slide suddenly changed. Profanity became viewable on the screen. Circular images appeared in what appeared to be a drawing of male genitalia. And that's not all. Several seconds later, the racial slur beginning with the word N appeared on the screen, followed by pornographic images. And suppose for a moment you're Dennis. He froze. He must have been mortified. He must have been panicked. He must have been distraught. And he probably didn't know whether he should keep going or stop. I mean, he's being graded. So what does this mean? Well, I must imagine that when this was all over, when they kicked the offender out and Dennis was able to finish his dissertation, I must imagine that hearing those words for the very first time, "Congratulations, Dr. Dennis Johnson," must have felt very different. If I was Dennis, I probably would have felt defeated. What should have been a triumphant celebration, I would have felt absolutely ruined. I would have felt disrespected in a level that's almost unimaginable. And so the reason I bring this story up is because Zoom has emerged as an indispensable tool, a video conferencing tool for work and study for millions and millions as we're forced to stay home during the pandemic. But these incidents, so-called Zoom bombing, have prompted warnings from the FBI and indeed the victims themselves. So what we're seeing is technology being ingrained in society in a profound way. And what we're also seeing is an absence of adequate public policy to address this range of issues. And here, Dennis did everything right. He had passwords, he had a waiting room, he didn't share the link on social media, they kept the software updated. Dennis literally did everything right. And as he was defending his dissertation, this still happened because cyber criminals or cyber incidents like Dennis's are becoming all too familiar in today's society. Trolls are able to break into video conferences and they're scouring the internet for links in order to do this. In fact, one intelligence firm discovered that over 500,000 Zoom links are being sold on the dark web and in hacker forums. So what this demonstrates to me is that in today's world, in today's digital society, we are more vulnerable now than we have ever been in the past. And what that's going to require is a coherent public policy discussion about the digital society that we want. When I tell you a story about Dennis Johnson, it should follow with a profound sense of outrage. This is unacceptable. If technology is not happening to us. Indeed, we're shaping technology. The way that we shape technology is not just ones and zeros, rather it's public policy, and that's what we need to get to. And that's what we're going to speak about tonight. Now, before we go on, I will tell you a little bit about CIGI. So CIGI is known as the Center for International Governance Innovation, and we're based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. and we focus on the public policy issues at the intersection of technology and international governance. And so that's what brings me to you this evening. So let's talk about some of the public policy issues that have become more pronounced now than ever before. Cybersecurity, the impact of COVID-19 on cybersecurity. As hospitals are facing a surge in patients and critical equipment shortages stemming from this pandemic, they're increasingly becoming the target of hackers as well. Cyber threats to healthcare groups and the public have spiked during the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. And indeed, bad guys are doing bad things during a bad time. They know that people are more vulnerable now. They know that we're spread out. They know that we're dispersed on the internet, and they know how reliant we are and indeed how anxious people are. And they are taking advantage of those anxieties. The WHO itself has been the victim. The Department of Health and Human Services in the United States has fallen prey. So cyber criminals are using ransomware to hold hospitals and medical services hostage daily. Let's talk about that for a moment. Some examples. On April 21st, a hospital in Colorado was hit with a devastating ransomware attack that rendered the hospital system unavailable that stored patient information. It was inoperable. This actually forced the hospital to revert to using paper forms, which slowed down service. And during a time when minutes make all the difference, this is completely unacceptable. A hospital in the Czech Republic was hit by a cyber attack. A Canadian medical lab was the victim of an attack in April that involved encrypted computer files on several individuals associated with the Canadian Government Health Organization that were actively involved in the COVID-19 response efforts, and indeed a Canadian university conducting COVID-19 research. Locking hospitals out of their critical systems will not only delay the swift medical response required during these unprecedented times, it could directly lead to deaths. And experts warn that these attacks are likely to increase. So this demonstrates that we have a patchwork of systems and under-resourced cybersecurity and IT systems in our country and indeed around the world. And if that's not a public policy issue, I don't know what is. In fact, these malware deployments have grown in sophistication. And here's the really scary part: ransomware and malware. You used to have to know how to code in order to launch one of these attacks. But now there's a wide range of packages that are available for sale on the dark web. And if you don't know what the dark web is, it's the portion of the internet that's inaccessible to search engines. It's an area where criminals like to lurk. Think of it as the back alley. But it's interesting. You can purchase these, but there's updates, there's technical support, you can have access to CNC servers, and there's even a range of payment plans in order to access some of this technology. So now hackers, as I said, do not need technical skills to launch attacks anymore. Literally anyone can do this. You can even get a subscription plan for as low as $120 US per month. You can buy access to servers for $8 to $15 per server, where you can search by country, by operating system, and which payment sites users have access from that server. For something called a denial of service attack, you could rent literally a denial of service bot ranging from 1 hour to 24 hours, and you'll pay a price depending on how much traffic you want to direct at the target to knock them off the internet. But as an example, you can have your own image displayed on a screen for as little as $60 for 3 hours. So, ransomware attacks are becoming more common, healthcare institutions are falling prey, and we have an inadequate system to protect these core entities right now. So that's part of what we're looking at right in this situation. And let me make one comment about the international rule structure around this. So this is not the purpose of tonight's discussion, but if I were to say that the international rules surrounding cybersecurity were inadequate, that would probably be the understatement of this discussion. So we have an inadequate system at the very highest level, where countries are literally attacking other countries, or now the population within those countries. And one of the reasons that they're able to do that is because the international rule structure around this is not good enough. And we need to do better. And so that is another public policy issue that we're going to have to think about. There's also phishing scams. So people have heard all about the phishing scams, right? This is when fraudsters attempt to steal money or information from unsuspecting users with fake emails or text messages. Here we had one in Canada where fraudsters pretended to be processing EI claims, preying on Canadians who'd recently lost their jobs. Users were asked to enter their details only to have that information accessed by criminals. And so this is the world we are living in, where people are preying on individuals during their most vulnerable time. In fact, the Prime Minister even indicated to people to warn them about this behavior. So this is an inherent vulnerability. But what else is happening right now? We need to talk about surveillance and mass data collection. So here we have several governments the world over that are introducing a range of aggressive digital tracking and physical surveillance measures to help reveal patterns that are driving the spread of the coronavirus. So that's really an issue. So here, there's a range of countries. So Ecuador, here the government's tracking the location of cell phones to enforce a 9 p.m. curfew. Hong Kong, some countries are wearing, or some residents are being asked to wear a wristband to alert authorities that if they leave their place of quarantine. In China, they're using facial recognition cameras, drones, and a government app to log citizens' details and those of their close contacts. A range of other countries are undertaking activities in this space as well. India, Germany, Israel, Pakistan, Russia. There's nationwide programs taking place around the world right now. And here's the really tricky part, is that many of these have avoided public scrutiny and political scrutiny. So we're collecting data where there's significant privacy and civil liberties implications, but a lot of this is just happening because of the speed of the pandemic. So in the Canadian case, Innovation Minister Navdeep Bains stated in a recent press conference that all options are on the table when it comes to reducing the spread of COVID-19. He said that the government is engaged with some early stage technology projects designed to contain the virus. So although the government has not made any final decision on projects or apps, Canada's public Chief Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, says that contact tracing is a key measure to contain the virus. 100%. Contact tracing is an important mechanism. It's not just that. The question is how we conduct contact tracing, how we make it effective, how we limit the scope of privacy intervention as much as possible, and when the pandemic is over, how we ensure that those privacy rights that are so fundamental to a free and democratic society are ingrained. And I'm not saying this is about the Canadian case study at all. But what I do know is this: it's very, very easy to turn on emergency powers. But oftentimes for many governments, it's a lot harder to turn them off. And so in Canada, the Information or the Privacy Commissioner gave a series of important principles and guidelines that should drive any of these types of technologies. Any intervention should be necessary and proportionate. When the data should be de-identified whenever possible. The impacts of data collection on vulnerable people need to be considered. For instance, algorithmic decision-making or AI can contain biases that create the disproportionate impact on users. And so when you think about this more principled approach, we need to understand that there are policy implications for the decisions that are being made. As an example, what are the time limits on these types of interventions? And when will that data be destroyed, and how will it be used, and by whom will it be accessed? These are all pertinent questions that one needs to consider when designing policy interventions. Let's talk a little bit about disinformation, because that's something we're seeing as well too. We are in an absolutely chaotic information environment, and there's opportunities for malicious actors to spread falsified content, taking advantage of these gaps. And so we've seen various types of this. There's an indistinguishable mix of unidentified information, helpful information, misinformation, intentionally manipulated disinformation that are all creating havoc. And so there's examples that we've seen. One example: if you drink Lysol, that will prevent COVID. If you drink water every 15 minutes, that will prevent COVID. If you take ibuprofen tablets, that will actually increase the virus's spread. There's been information campaigns where you need to adhere to a curfew because the government is going to spray cities with disinfectant to kill COVID-19. And so there's major disinformation campaigns that are being launched right now, and indeed some of them are being launched by countries. And so that is a serious issue that we need to be thinking about. Now, here's something that's also worth mentioning. In March, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter all started sending home thousands of their content moderators. These companies were being forced to rely more heavily on algorithms to do content moderation. And so there again, technology pops up in our life, and we don't necessarily know very much about those algorithms, nor do we know how they're making those types of decisions. And so here it's interesting. We have to have a conversation about the role that these platforms take in our society, and indeed how they do content moderation, because they are now the public square. They're taking a very, very public role, and the information on these platforms, if it's disinformation or misinformation, can have serious impacts. And so we need to think about these public policy issues as well. So now, let's talk about think tanks for a minute. What are think tanks? What do they do? How do they work? Well, there's about 50 think tanks around the world, depending on how you add them up. And at base, they're organizations that generate policy-oriented research, analysis, and advice on domestic and international issues, enabling policymakers and the public to make informed decisions about public policy. These institutions act as a bridge, oftentimes, between the academic and the policymaking communities, and between states and civil society, serving in the public interest as an independent voice that translates the applied and basic research into a language that's understandable, reliable, and accessible for policymakers and the public. So, think tanks may perform this role in a range of different ways. And in fact, there's a number of different types of think tanks. There's independent think tanks that are completely independent from government. There's government-affiliated think tanks that are actually part of government, but a little bit outside. There's quasi-governmental, there's university-affiliated. There's ones that are even part of political parties. And also, even some corporate actors or for-profit entities have their own think tanks. So what are think tanks actually doing right now? Well, I've talked to you a little bit about CIGI's research, but I don't want to turn this discussion into a public service announcement for my own think tank. But we were talking about platform governance. And so we've launched a major initiative to support something called the International Grand Committee of Parliamentarians. This is a group that's looking at how to coordinate across borders to better understand the range of public policy issues that are implicated when we talk about how we're going to govern platforms going forward. We've also launched a major project looking at how gender or online violence impacts people with different genders differently. So how do we prevent online gender-based harm, especially in the global south, especially where people are the most vulnerable, especially where the legal regimes are the least adequate. And so these are two areas where we're advancing on this policy space to try and better articulate a framework to govern these technologies. But as I said, I didn't want to make this just about CIGI. So there are, while CIGI focuses at this intersection between the international and technology, others are doing great work across a range of spectrum. There's public health think tanks that are working on care capacity and mental health. There's economic think tanks that are looking at financial markets, supply disruption, trade, travel, transport, unemployment. There's groups working on the social issues, food insecurity, gender dimensions, education, human rights, working from home, foreign policy, China relations, you name it. There's think tanks that are working on it. Let me give you a few examples. So in Washington, D.C., there's a very pronounced group of think tanks. And so one of them, the Heritage Foundation, right now they're maintaining a database of COVID-19 cases for each state. They've created a national coronavirus commission that's looking at how to restart the economy and minimize job losses. They're looking at strategies for ensuring food supply during the pandemic, and they're advising policymakers on how to help low-income individuals access care during the pandemic, and they've actually developed a healthcare resource kit. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, they're looking at how the pandemic is actually reshaping global protests. Think about that. One aspect of a democracy is protest, and so you can't really protest when you're at home. And so, that's another area that's being considered right now. Brookings Institution, their work is looking at how COVID's going to impact the world's poorest people. They're looking at lessons that we can learn from the Ebola crisis and how we can fight COVID-19 based on that. They're looking at the changing labor market for non-traditional workers. So there's, as I said, there's lots and lots of interesting research, analysis, and policy advice going on in these groups, in these think tanks, or in these policy research institutes. The Center for American Progress, they're looking at health disparities by race and ethnicity. and how the current crisis will impact the future of work. And they're looking at tracking international lessons that can be learned. So they're looking at how other countries are reopening and then trying to apply those same lessons in their own country. Think tanks are actually working together now as well. This is something I've only seen little bits of in my career. But on April 7th, there was over 300 think tank executives and scholars from 170 institutes from over 60 countries around the world that got together and agreed to work together so that we can use our policy capacity to save lives and livelihoods. And so we were invited to tackle these new and unprecedented policy problems in our communities and to basically try and articulate new ideas and advance a policy framework that can help people. Because when stakeholders look to think tanks in a time of crisis, we owe it to them to be at the forefront of research. We owe it to them to be at the forefront of innovative policy solutions. We owe it to them to provide digestible strategies to government, civil society, and private section decision makers. It's during a time of crisis that we owe it to them to be at our best. So thank you very much. And I believe we're going to have we've got some time for questions right now as well.
Aaron, thanks for that great presentation. It was a little daunting to hear all of that information nonetheless, but hopefully it was well received by everyone. So I just have a few questions now, and we already have some questions that have come in from the audience, which is great, and we will get to those momentarily. So in times of crisis, this one in particular underscores the importance of global cooperation. I mean, it's kind of a profound time because everybody around the world is in a very similar boat, working through the societal, the cybersecurity impacts, economic impacts. So in what ways do you think COVID-19 could inspire better global cooperation?
It's a good question. I mean, maybe there's one observation that I'll make right at the outset here. You tell me what's international and what's domestic right now, because I'm having a hard time figuring that out. Case in point, the N95 masks and the 3M issue that we had at the border. So the United States decided kind of unilaterally that they would put a ban on the shipment of 3M N95 masks into Canada. Is that a trade issue, a national security issue, an international issue, a domestic issue, a supply chain issue? Sorry, I just realized it's 7:30, so out my window, we're thanking our primary workers, and that's actually apropos. I'm glad that we're doing it. It's all of these issues that are confounded with one another, and so what happens to your neighbor actually happens to you, right? So this started in one small village. This started in Wuhan, China. And just look how quickly it spread across the world. And so now the lines between the domestic and the international are razor thin. And the lines between these discrete policy areas are also equally thin. So what it means is that international cooperation on this is no longer an option. It's an existential issue. And to be fair, countries need to get past themselves, right? We need to think about this in a geostrategic way and in terms of everyone's long-term stability and everyone's long-term interest. This is not just about what's going to happen right now, but it's about how we secure ourselves for the future going forward. And if we can't cooperate internationally, there's just no way we're going to solve it.
Right. And turning back to think tanks, so how do you think think tanks should continue working with policymakers on these issues? From everybody's experience at CIGI, once this pandemic hit, we've been working quite vigorously trying to tackle some of these issues. But once we're past COVID-19, how do we ensure that these gains are not lost?
Well, think tanks have one advantage, right? And it's that we can think in the long term, the medium and the long-term policy horizons. And so right now, if you're a government policymaker, you're not thinking about the long term. You're thinking about controlling and preventing the spread of the virus, and you're thinking about how to make sure that people can put food on their table. You're in the immediate policy term, like right there, what's right in front of you. But the problem is that these types of issues require long-term strategic policy frameworks. And as I said earlier, there's a dynamic interplay across a range of policy areas. So international trade and supply chain issues, intellectual property and ventilator design, when you start to think about it, it looks like a very, very complicated ball of yarn, because all of these policy issues are intermingled with each other. And what think tanks have the ability to do is take a step back and examine those issues in the medium and the long term. And so what we can do to facilitate or to help policymakers is do the best research that we can, bring the best minds to bear that we can, and to take a medium and long-term strategic view, so that when we do come out of this and people are looking for answers to prevent it from happening again, or to mitigate the negative aspects of it when it happens again, across that entirety of those horizontal policy issues that I spoke about, that's where we come in.
That's great. Going back to the cybersecurity aspect of your presentation, this is an issue that CIGI has been working on for a number of years. We've certainly seen an uprise in it in fake news, as you mentioned, and cybersecurity breaches. So the coronavirus pandemic has already had a profound effect on society's digital transition. But what are some key lessons that we're learning amid this outbreak, and are there any kind of new digital strategies that you think might need to prevail moving forward?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so obviously we talked about cybersecurity, so I won't go into detail on that, but we got to do better there. It's as simple as that. The status quo is completely not sustainable. We're putting buggy technology out as fast as we possibly can. It's flawed, it's broken, it's easily accessible, and then we run behind and patch it later and just deal with the damage. But the damage threshold is becoming too high, so we owe ourselves a coherent conversation about cybersecurity standards at the front end, and we can talk about what that means later, because there are some groups in Canada, not least of which the CIO Strategy Council, that's doing some great work on this. But thinking through this, we've had a forced digital transformation, so we need to talk about issues like bandwidth, right? So even Andrea's video when she was introducing us was grainy and it was hoppy. She's sitting in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, a G7 country, ostensibly digital north, the great hub of innovation in Canada, and we can't even get a strong internet signal, right? And so what does that say about our bandwidth? What does that say about our infrastructure? How do we wish to structure our digital society when we can't even do the basic stuff right now? And so we need to talk about those peaks in demand. We need to talk about how we do our own digital infrastructure. And when I think about this type of stuff, I force myself to look for the seeds of opportunity in a crisis, because they do say that human ingenuity is at its highest during a time of crisis. And so what I'd like to push us to think about is what we want the world to look like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, and what are the decisions we need to make right now in order to make that happen. And I can tell you right now, probably some of them aren't going to be easy. There's going to be investments that aren't going to pay off for some time, but we need to be coherent, we need to be strategic, and we need to make those tough decisions now, so that we're better set up to actually have the digital society we want.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. Going back to your bandwidth comment there, if this event was taking place at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, I wouldn't be the moderator, because there's all of my neighbors are on the same internet, the 5 internet that Bell is run through our neighborhood, and it's just very spotty. So I'm certainly on that.
And I don't want to talk about the principle in net neutrality, because I don't want the audience to fall asleep. Well, I know this actually is being recorded, so I will talk about net neutrality just for 1 second. And so if anyone has trouble falling asleep, you can just play this section of the discussion back, and it'll knock you right out. We have this principle of net neutrality, right? And the idea is that internet traffic is treated neutrally. So you can't slow down traffic based on what it is. And so what that means is that video conferences like this, or indeed work conferences, are treated the exact same as cat videos on YouTube. And that makes sense for some things, right? So for example, we wouldn't want to have an internet service provider like Bell throttle someone else's traffic in order to speed up their own content, because that wouldn't necessarily be fair. But right now, when there's limited bandwidth and the almost entirety of our I guess non-essential economy is pushed online, do we have to have a conversation about net neutrality? What does enhanced digital infrastructure look like? These are the types of conversations that I think we do need to be having And so we need to find ways to advance those discussions with a view to the best research and the best analysis that we can, because ultimately, if you know better, you can do better.
Great. I'm going to switch it over to some audience questions. We have quite a few coming in, and I think it'll spark some further discussion here. So the first one, was there any consensus in the global town hall meeting?
No. Well, yes and no. So the global town hall meeting was really, I think it was a show of solidarity more than anything else. And so to the extent that we're all shocked by this, to the extent that we're all hurt by this, to the extent that everyone there wants to do the very best that they can for the people around them, I think there was consensus around that. And there was also consensus to try and contemplate a way forward where think tanks from across disciplines, from across states can work together. That's a work in progress, but like I said, it's something unprecedented. I've never seen it in my career, having that many think tanks around a table trying to figure out a way to work together. So to that extent, I guess there was consensus, but moving forward and next steps is a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if we had this event in about a month or so, we might be able to discuss some of the workshops, but it was, certainly really interesting to have all of those groups from around the world come together. Next question, in the context of the COVID crisis, is there work being undertaken to make the link to environmental degradation, including the issues of intersections between humans and animal species, such as illegal trade in wildlife as a source of the virus and of climate change? So not quite up CIGI's area of expertise, but I'm not sure if this is something you can weigh in on or not.
Well, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to get out too far. I mean, obviously, I've read what everyone else has read, that you look at carbon emissions during COVID and they're down. And I think, there's going to have to be some thinking around that. And there's people that are way more qualified than me that are going to be doing that type of analysis. And as it relates to human animal transmissibility of disease, they don't teach you very much about epidemiology in law school, so I'm just going to take a hard pass on that one.
Yeah. How do we align the goals of restoring a healthy economy when there is significant political divergence today?
So, I mean, I'm assuming that question's going at maybe two vectors. One is how quickly you open up, and one is how much social assistance is offered to various groups during this time. I mean, those are political decisions, right? Those are the types of decisions for which there are trade-offs that need to be made. And in our system, in our democratic system, those trade-offs are made at the political level. And so that's inevitably what's going to happen. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing. But what I will say is this: I mean, as long as those debates are open and transparent, as long as our political leaders are being asked to account for their views publicly, then I think that's okay. Because don't forget, at the end of this, we all have recourse, right? We're all the bosses in a democratic society. We get to vote. But I will also say this: I mean, I am at least heartened by the way that the discourse is shaping up in this country between political leaders at different levels of government. There's a level of civility that I haven't seen certainly in a number of years, and I'm heartened by that. But at the end of the day, of course, these are political decisions. We live in a free and democratic society. This have to be made by political leaders because there's a series of trade-offs that need to be made. And hopefully, I think where think tanks can come in is making sure that the policymakers in that process have the best evidence and the best analysis that we can possibly marshal. Because as I said earlier, know better and do better.
Right. So the next question is up your alley in terms of cyber governance. So somebody wants to know what the federal appetite is for meaningful cyber governance, and is the EU still leading in this space?
Well, I mean, maybe there's an issue of kind of nomenclature here, right? So in Canada, we released a national cybersecurity strategy in June 2018, we set up something called the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity that is trying to work with Canadian companies and businesses to help them understand the cyber risk threats. We also increased our capacity in a group called the CSE to conduct offensive and defensive cyber operations. And so Canada has actually come quite a long way on the cybersecurity side of the ledger. But I think maybe what that question was actually going toward was data governance, right? So not just cybersecurity, but what we do with data, how we access data, how we trade in data, who processes data, how long it's kept for, what we know about people, and how that data can be used. And that's an interesting set of questions. So no, Europe is in front of the class on this. I mean, GDPR the general directive in Europe is the kind of the standard that most will hold up to aspire to. It's clear that in Minister Bain's mandate letter that they do, this government wants to change the data governance architecture in Canada. And so I actually wrote recently on this issue. And what I was surprised by when I thought about it is if you look at an issue like privacy, so look at the way privacy is dealt with at the government level, right? So now there's no right of privacy in the charter, but there's a right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and there's a right to be free from unreasonable search. And I would call those fairly analogous. And there's also something called the Privacy Act, which deals with how the federal government handles your privacy. If the government breaches one of those rights in the charter that I just talked about, the implications of doing so are severe. Indeed, if it's in the context of a criminal case, a criminal, somebody who is otherwise guilty, can literally walk out of the courtroom. And that mechanism is set up so that the government does not infringe on that right, just to show how serious it is in a free and democratic society. And then you compare that and contrast that to our private sector. And here, if you click the little box that says, I accept, you know when you scroll through the 200 pages of legal mumbo jumbo and you click I accept, right there, you've agreed to whatever those terms said they can do with your data. And so I think maybe that's what the question was getting at, is how do we deal with those types of issues? And so right now we're in the process of a legislative overhaul. But what I argued for was to make sure if the right to privacy is so profound on the one hand that a criminal can walk out of a courtroom in order to make sure the government doesn't infringe that right. And then over here, if it's so weak, but it's the same right, it's the same thing that's at play. I have a hard time understanding that. And so what I argued for is that we need to elevate the right, both in the government system, but also in the private system. Because at the end of the day, it's our privacy that's at play. It doesn't matter if it's the government or the private sector. It's the core of who we are as an individual. And I argue that needs to be protected.
Right. I mean, you wrote an op-ed on it that was published this week. So if anybody has further curiosity on that topic, you can head to our website, and under the opinion section, Aaron's op-ed on that should be one of the first or second ones up there. So somebody wants to just discuss the COVID-19 app monitoring guidelines. So what happens if it's stored outside of Canada, and if it's subject to the Patriot Act? I believe that's American, so maybe they're talking about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But could you talk a little bit about the app monitoring and perhaps contact tracing that we're seeing in the
Sure, no, I'm happy to do that. The short answer is wherever the data is resident will likely be the law that's going to apply to it. And so if your data routes through the United States, then yes, then US law would apply in that context. And so that's one thing to be mindful of. But let's talk about the contact tracing in the app. So most of the stuff right now that we're seeing is actually voluntary, right? So people go on their phone and they download the app, and now their phone is contact tracing for them. Here's the issue though. I mean, so there's the privacy stuff, right? We talked about that and what those companies know about you and how the data is used, stored, when it's disposed of. All of those stuff are pertinent issues. And I bet you if you ask 100 app companies, you're going to get 100 different answers to all those questions that I just raised. Because you recall, you clicked I accept. And you should have read the 200 pages. But here's the other side of it. These apps, they're known for both underreporting and overreporting. And so suppose, for example, I'm sitting beside an individual and my phone contact traces, they know that I've been within, let's say, 4 feet of that individual, you know. So the app then realizes, oh man, you were in touch with this individual. This individual has COVID. I'm going to freak out, right? I'm going to run and go get a test. But what if there's a wall in the way, right? The Bluetooth signal is not going to differentiate. What if the wall is permeable enough that our Bluetooth connected? And so there, I'm going to put I and everyone who I have been in touch with is going to get an alert that says you've been exposed, and you're going to rush and get a test, and you're going to put undue pressure on the healthcare system that's not required because you actually weren't exposed. Now, here's the other side of it. What about an individual who was in proximity to a number of surfaces and then left? And then you go and you touch those surfaces. You've been exposed, but your contact tracing app ain't going to show you that. And so we rush to technology without asking those hard questions that I set out, which is like, how is the data going to be used? How is it going to be stored? Who's going to process it? Who's going to access it? How long will it be used for? And for what alternative purposes in addition to contact tracing? We haven't talked about that. And then how effective is it? Like, we have this tendency just to rush to technology without asking those hard questions. And I think it's the job of people like me or people in a think tank to ask them, to raise them, and to try and articulate a framework that it can at least answer them. Because if you can't answer them, we have a bigger problem.
Right. There was one of our fellows, Teresa Scassa, who's also works closely on this issue, and she had done an interview with the CBC, I believe it was last week, and she made the most simple, obvious point regarding contact tracing that was kind of like one of those duh moments where she said, our most vulnerable people that would benefit from contact tracing likely aren't on phone technology. So how is it going to be helpful for them? And it was like, oh, right, our elderly population likely isn't carrying around cell phones like we are. And would they get those alerts? So.
Yeah, no, it's just, I mean, it's so attractive, like, especially in the way that our society works now, to hope that there's an app for that. I mean, there's an app for everything else. Why couldn't we just fix this by hitting the Play Store and downloading something? But unfortunately, it's just not that simple. This is the type of stuff that requires an actual public policy, a frank public policy discussion based on research and evidence.
Excellent. So that's all the questions that we have. Was there any final comments you wanted to make just before we wrap up? Anything we missed in the question period or that you've thought of?
No, I mean, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I appreciate that this is a hard time for everyone. And I would imagine most people are like me, where your inbox is overwhelmed with webinars constantly, and everyone's just trying to do the best that they can. So I'm really happy that people came out for this discussion. I appreciated the questions, and at the end of the day, it's like I said, we're in this together, and we all have to do the best that we can. And I think the organization that I work for is doing the best that we can to try and articulate a policy framework around some of these issues. Because like I said, once you know better, you can do better. So thank you very much for everyone for coming. And thank you, Kristy, for your questions as well. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.